All right, folks, welcome back to class time number 2. In the previous video, I discussed, basically the early history of the Americas. We have Columbus finding port and landing in the Bahamas, which he believed was the West Indies. You have Vespucci sailing the coast of South America, and cartographers beginning to map this new landmass. You have people settling all over, expanding all over, looking for cities of gold, looking for spices, looking for new products to send back and to take back and sell to the people of Europe. It was very much just a time of, we want to go see what's there and bring it back. But basically the land crisis in Europe is going to quickly decide that's not good enough. That's not enough for what we need. And what they needed was land. In the late 1500s, early 1600s, Europe had grown into a very densely populated area. Much as you see in cities all over the globe today. People have children. Societies grow. People move around. Very much so in Europe, where someone who was born and raised in France could settle in London. Someone raised in London could settle in Barcelona. And business would do that from time to time. And that prompted the desire for basically you to move and find a new location to set up shop. It was in the early 1600s that you have the real beginning of this. Now, yes, in the 1500s, Sir Walter Raleigh was sent to found a colony in the Virginias, and it was Roanoke Island. Unfortunately, you had just what was expected. The climate, the people around them, those being Native Americans, the allergens and other pathogens that are different from what you face in Europe, or did at the time. All of that led to a failed colony by 1610. And by the late 1500s. In early 1607, you have the Virginia Company of London. You have 125 settlers sent to the Chesapeake Bay, and it founded Jamestown. Many, if not all, of the early settlements were named for British nobility. King James, Jamestown, or for locations there. You had the Dutch settlers, which had New Amsterdam, which later became New York. They might be giants, might want to take a history class, but I can tell you why they changed it. The English settlers wanted the settlement named after York, England, not after Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, when you get to Jamestown in 1607, you have very bad water. I mean, this is not where you have the advanced society of London or Manchester or Edinburgh. It's just an open area, and the water there was not very good at all. It was also extremely cold, and without their buildings and their fires, which they'd grown used to in England, because England in the winter is very cold. They're facing two hardships right off the bat. Unfortunately, they also are very greedy. The 125 people sent to settle Jamestown are the ones who are told, you're there to extend the fur trade. In that time, of course, Britain would have had rabbits and foxes and other animals in England and throughout Europe that they could trap and kill for fur. The Americas were very much just a wild continent. Animals would have been far more plentiful. The fur trade was a gold mine, and everyone wanted their piece. And unfortunately, that led to a lot of fighting and a lot of things that doomed the settlement. It was in 1608 that we have John Smith, the male lead, if you will, of the story of Pocahontas and the Powhatan people. You have that story happening right around the starving time. This is very much the beginning of the Americas, because when hardship happens, one of two things will happen. People will band together, and they will realize we have to stand as one group or we will all perish. Or they just all go their own separate ways. Now, granted, some of them would have definitely struck out on their own. If they succeeded or failed, it was not recorded. But you did have a large group of them band together, and this later attempt, after Sir Walter Raleigh and after the first attempts at colonization, succeeded because of alliances with the indigenous people, the Native American Indians who were around them. Trade was opened up. There wasn't the antagonism. There wasn't these are savage people, we must kill them all. It was, we need to work together. And after emerging from the harsh winter and the starving time, this is where we get the image shown at Thanksgiving all over the country of that first table filled with settlers and Native Americans, and foods that would never have been seen in England prior to that time. It absolutely was this first coming together and working together between the settlers and the Native Americans that spurred the later creation of the official holiday of Thanksgiving, that being in latter November, a time when, like those first settlers, they gathered to give thanks for surviving the harsh winter. I don't know why Thanksgiving was put prior to the coldest part of winter as a holiday, probably just because we had holidays throughout the rest of the year. But it was. As we move forward, though, this is where expansion, industry, human nature to see opportunity really takes off. You have John Rolfe, which begins the tobacco industry. 1619, very quickly after that, we have the House of Burgesses, a legislative body here in the colonies. Our first attempt at self-governance. Granted, yes, the House of Burgesses would have been beholden to the royalty in England. They would have very much been a body that would have received direction from the Crown and from Parliament, and then been the one to carry this out or implement those things within the colonies. There was, I assume, some limited autonomy because you didn't have communication other than months at sea, and by the time it got there, it was useless. So the House of Burgesses would have been able to see that there was a need for this regulation on industry, or this rule on society, or this other need, and been able to act on those things, as long as they were then going to say to Parliament and ultimately the Crown, we've done this because it was needed, and the Crown and Parliament would have been able to say, no, we don't like that, undo it. We were British subjects, and if you watched the series Sleepy Hollow, you would have seen Ichabod Crane's character correctly point out that Paul Revere would not have said the British were coming. At that time, we were all British subjects. He would have said the regulars or the redcoats to indicate the British army, which was sent to subjugate the colonies. So up until this point, in the early 1600s, all of those in the colonies were British subjects. We were simply a slight shade more autonomous than the rest of the British Empire. 1622, we have a problem arise over land and tobacco. We had a settler who killed a member of the Powhatan tribe. Powhatan then decided we're going to kill a quarter of the English in the area. It had been over land, people encroaching on their land due to tobacco. And this is one thing that happens very often in an expanding and very new country and a very new experiment in society. When you have settlers that come from a country thousands of miles away looking for new products, looking for new sources of wealth, new land to live on, you're going to clash with the people who are there. And unfortunately, the British subjects at the time did not act in the best of ways all the time. They would resort to, nope, we're here now, you leave or you die. And unfortunately, the Powhatan decided, no, now a lot of you are going to die. Then we have Nathaniel Bacon, 1676, leads a group against the Pamunkey people and the governor of Jamestown, ultimately, which is why this push against the Pamunkey people ended. The governor of Jamestown died of dysentery. He obviously didn't play the Oregon Trail because that's where you die of dysentery. And this begins the revolution, the whisperings of revolt due to taxation without representation. Now, during all this time, I'm not going to gloss over this, but during this time, from the first expedition of Columbus to find the West Indies, all the way up to nearly 1700, so over 200 years, the Portuguese had been running the slave trade. They would basically purchase or just take slaves from Africa, being given to them or sold to them by other tribes in Africa. Very similar to the settlers versus the Powhatan or the Pamunkey. They wanted other people's land, and they would attack a neighboring tribe, and the Portuguese were willing to give them money and take their neighboring tribesmen away. It was seen as viable because the slaves were not being transported anywhere else in Africa. They were being transported primarily to the Caribbean at the time, ultimately up into the Americas as well, the North American continent, because they couldn't just go home. And there was, of course, pushback on this. There would be slaves who would just jump ship and drown. Very famously in Black Panther, Eric Killmonger says, "Bury me at sea with my ancestors who knew it was better to drown than live in bondage." There were those who would escape. And there are entire societies that started due to these escaped Africans who escaped slavery. Those who did not were brought to the Americas in the Caribbean and further up and down the coast, where they would be the ones harvesting the tobacco or the cotton or the sugar, which would then be sold back to Europe. One of the darkest times in human history. Unfortunately, not over yet. If you look at the Middle East and you look at other parts of that region of the planet, indentured servitude and slavery is still very much a thing. I will never apologize, but I will also not excuse slavery. I don't apologize because I never did it, and I never would. My ancestors fought for the Union. Slavery was abolished, and unfortunately, an excellent man in Abraham Lincoln was murdered by people who couldn't accept that they'd lost a war. But we need to recognize that it did happen, but is now over. We're not to a state where all tension is gone, and we won't be for likely decades or longer. But we need to stop twisting history to say that because people who are now dead did something horrific, people who had no connection to them other than being an ancestor or a descendant must now be punished. That's my sociological rant. That's all I'm going to say on that. We will be looking at more of that trade as we get into, in the next video, the colonies. And this is really the bedrock and the launching pad for the history of the United States, because this is where it truly begins to become one group of people who will ultimately decide they can rule themselves. Leave your comments below. As always, be civil. We're here to discuss, dissent, and debate. We are not here to scream and yell like toddlers. Please remember that and just be civil. As always, please like and share the video to increase the conversation and to affect the algorithm. As well, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications. I'm doing the giveaway at 500, 1,000, and 1,500 subscribers. The faster we get there, the faster that happens. Until next time, everyone have a wonderful day.